Welcome to our very first of what will be a series of webisodic debates on the future of work. My name is Angela Damiani, and I'm one of your hosts for today. The goal for today is to have a lively chat on the future of AI at work. And so whether you're coming from a place of fear or excitement about the new technologies that are available to us, the truth is that AI is here and it's here to stay. What we're going to go through today is a variety of different topics. So we're going to start around the concept of the effect of AI on trust, especially online. We're going to jump into how it's going to affect us at work. And then we're going to be talking about how, ideally, in the best of all worlds, AI does not have the robots come and steal all our jobs, but rather create new jobs and, more importantly, more time for all of us. I want to encourage you all to join the conversation via the chat. Amanda and I will be watching for that. We want this to be something that we're actively engaging all of you on. And so let's just jump in. Amanda, why don't we start? I'll have you introduce yourself in a more formal way.
Good morning. I'm Amanda Daring. Thrilled to be partnering with Angela on this. This is a topic that in our free time together, we nerd on quite a bit and thought we should do this more publicly and get more people involved in this conversation. So thrilled to be chatting about it. What I will note is that, like the rest of us, we're all figuring this out as we go. So hopefully we'll explore some ideas. It's not our intention to say anything with a full amount of certainty. Other than that, people have figured out a lot of challenges and they'll figure out this one. So thanks for joining us.
I love that as a bit of a palate cleanser for us. As I said, my name is Angela Damiani. I am business partners with Amanda at a firm called Nuance. Excuse me. I also own a different firm called Nuwaki. Forgive my slip there. I'll just go ahead and say on this topic, I am, in full disclosure, a late adopter on the spectrum of technology. And I tend to, even though one of our core values at Nuwaki is to change always and always, approach any new technology with a bit of fear. So you'll note that reticence in me as we go through this. I realize that this is inevitable and it's happening, but it tends to be my frame of mind. So if any of you are like me, don't feel like you can't also sort of express any trepidation you might be having as we jump into this. But let's start broad, Amanda, with the topic of trust. So in your, humble opinion, how is AI going to affect the fact that we already maybe don't totally trust one another, knowing that we know most things online are not, well, even the concept of truth and trust has been in question for the last half a decade. Thoughts on this?
Sure. I think it seems to me undeniable that skepticism is growing, right? And so when I imagine having 10 or 100, and those are really lame small numbers, and it'll really be more like 1,000,000 times more content out there, right? I can only imagine that people will be increasingly skeptical about the truth. From my perspective, though, I think a lot of people in the Web3 and blockchain community have been saying this for a while, that they see trust as becoming something we build into systems that's still pretty technology based, right? That there are other ways we might use technology to leverage trust or build trust, and that kind of validation. I also think I tend to look at gaming communities and what they're doing. I am not a gamer, so my husband's probably overhearing this in the other room. I know I tell you all this stuff, but though that is big, large groups of strangers online coming together and achieving things together. That's where Discord started, right? Was just in a way to make gaming more effective. So to me, I don't think that AI pulls us out of online. I think it pulls us deeper in, but we maybe change the idea of, we maybe look for validation in a new way.
That's interesting. I guess I don't necessarily disagree with you, although I do have this hunch that there will be sort of a counterweight to all of this. So while we have to live the vast majority of our lives online. And that idea of sort of like extra validation or systems being put in place will probably be a part of the like protocol for that. I do sense that like there will be a contingency, and you're even seeing it with Gen Z, like adapting flip phones, you know what I mean? Like the ways we had in college, you know what I mean? To really like intentionally be offline. I have this sense that like, as a part of coming out of the pandemic and the rise of knowing that like you're being fed things and you don't really know if you're talking to a human, or now in this case, you know, an AI, that like IRL will be back with a vengeance. You know what I mean? Like that this will be, there'll be a counterculture that really enjoys in-person experience, that really knows that like what you can trust is what you can see. And that, you know, that idea of word of mouth, especially in the like, you know, vein of marketing, will be even more potent than ever before, because you'll know with certainty that, you know, the gravity of the relationship that you have with that person, you know what I mean, will be even more weighty as it comes to that sort of validation, whether or not you trust, whether or not something that not only that you consume, but you hear as fact will be, you know, seen as more fact in that way.
Yeah, I have heard of high schools having, I think they call them Luddite clubs, which is really fun name.
Yeah.
I'm curious though, I think that I can see that for people who at one point in their life had that experience, and so it feels like a return to it. I'm curious for people who really only have come up through those online connections, or not solely, but largely, if those in-person events, I think they'll eventually find them refreshing, but I'm curious if there'll be a little bumpiness in getting there. So for instance, you know, people know the manager that they work with to varying degrees, right? Some of them are best friends. Some of them are like, I have a manager, their email is this, right? Depending on where you work or the situation. But there was a Harvard Business School study, like it was like 3 years ago, and I can't imagine that it's gotten better, that 58% of people trusted a stranger more than their own manager. And so I think like in that way, those people already know each other and they prefer a stranger. Like I'm just very curious to see how that shakes out. And I think for me, if there's a way to make that exchange where it removes trust, right? There's a smart contract that we both, you know, understand and execute, and the money exchanges hands when the task exchanges hands. I don't know that I'm excited about it. I just suspect we'll work to remove the necessity of trust, which is probably sad, but I think there'll be ways to do that. Maybe it becomes a little more transactional.
That's curious. Yeah, I just think, I mean, I hear you, especially for digital natives, right? Like that don't remember the way that I can clearly. I mean, I was just in Europe last week with my husband, and we were talking about how much we wouldn't be able to get around without the GPS. You know what I mean? Like, and that I lived in Europe at a time when I didn't have a smartphone, and was I walking around with a map? I actually can't remember, you know what I mean, what that experience was actually like. So I had a time in my life where I wasn't so bound to the internet. And so perhaps you're right, like that Gen Z, and even my own children, Alpha, you know what I mean, won't know the difference. But I have to believe that, like, you know, for as vast and as accelerated as the technological advances have come upon us, like our brains have not evolved that quickly. And I do think people tend to default to humanity, like just because that's how we're constructed. And I don't know that, you know what I mean, we've become robotic, or we've been able to be even processing this sort of information as quickly as we have access to it. I want to transition us, if you don't mind, going a little bit deeper into the topic here, into how does AI affect work? So, you know, are the robots coming for our jobs in that way? Is this something that we need to be afraid of? What do you think?
Big question. Now I'm just going to talk for the next 20 minutes by myself. So I have so many thoughts on this. No, what I think is that the types of skills required will continue to shift, right? I think right now there are a lot of jobs that are based around task completion, right? I take this information and I get it over here, or I compile different types of reporting, or I do all these things. And there's sort of two elements to this. One is that it's not like technology is new, and there's a lot that we could have automated by now. It maybe wouldn't have been AI that learned, but it could have been an automatic technological process that someone coded, right? And we haven't. I think people who are in a SaaS situation and try to do like self-service are like, oh, we need salespeople, right? Like, it's not that I think all jobs will be gone, but I do think that the nature of the jobs for many of them, in particular, like office type, like white collar professional workers, I think a lot of those skills will change from, I take inputs and I complete tasks and I hand something back, to being more around, I decide what direction we're heading. I shape a strategy that the AI then helps me execute, right? I think it's more of like a coworker that takes on a lot of the tasks. And I think that will be hard for people. I think myself included, right? I like to self-soothe with like a good checklist and to-dos. And, it's not that I think that all jobs will be gone. I think there'll be new ones. But I think that the skills required will be a lot more navigating gray area, will be a lot more discerning decisions and strategic work, versus more like task level work.
I
What do you
appreciate
think?
that as you know, uh, a Bachelor of Arts degree, right? Like the idea of like the critical thinking and the problem solving, right? Like perhaps I don't use the gender studies course that I took in college, but being able to sort of like hone those skills as a value, validate the fact that I got that degree is really, really helpful. I'm curious though, I do have this sense just because we live in a time of culture wars, right? Like everything ends up getting politically divisive in some way. I want to put out there that I think you're right that certain things will become more about deciding versus doing, but I bet you that there will be companies that declare that they have products that are human made as a cultural stance. The same way we've had like this is US made, or the way that we're even seeing like the sort of lines drawn in the sand about like, oh no, we're remote only, or we are all back in the office. Like it's meant to sort of like virtue signal certain things, and people identify with that and then, opt to both work at an environment in that way, as well as, I'm assuming that we're going to end up seeing like backlash related to how people consume things, right? Like to be able to say like, oh, I know for sure this was made by a human. There will be, and maybe you're right. Maybe it'll be generational. You know what I mean? Like that sort of like old guard wanting to ensure that it was like handcrafted in some way. Although handcrafting a spreadsheet, like what does that actually mean? But that I do have a sense that there will be that sort of like pushback or blowback from that.
I agree with you on that. I also think, especially work is one of the first spots that people are looking at from like a regulatory standpoint, which I think makes a lot of sense. New York is passing a local law, that you can't have an AI making hiring or promotion decisions unless it's been through like a certain extensive audit process. Now, I don't know that that's end state, like, oh, okay, great. But, who knows what, I don't have the details yet on what that audit means, and that can mean a lot of different things. And certainly, I don't think that a lot of these systems are totally ready, right? It's a common refrain, and there's truth to it, especially when it comes to hiring. That if you use an existing data set, we have structures that inherently have had bias in them, and so if we use all of that data to make all of these future decisions, how do we correct for that? I think really smart people are thinking about that. But I definitely see work as one of the first places that regulators will look, because it is just so impactful, right? Like we've built a lot around this idea of a job. And, historically, every major technological revolution has had this exact same fears and has ultimately resulted in more jobs, right? I look at the fact that our workforce participation is already falling. I look at the fact that our population demographics are changing. And I don't know that it's going to line up perfectly, right? I'm not naive to the fact that people will be adversely impacted, and just that change is for darn hard, right? To have done something for years and years and years that is maybe no longer required, and I have to learn this whole other skill set or job. I don't want to minimize that. But when we zoom way out, I look at those work and population trends, and I think we've been very constrained for years and years. I have a business that lives in that constraint, right? My business exists because there's been more jobs than people to fill them. And so it's not that I don't think that'll be impacted, but when you look back, we might be really glad that this, has unlocked some productivity, that this has unlocked some creative ideas from people. And I just don't think that the need for human judgment goes away entirely. I think, Wyatt's on this call. He helps us make everything beautiful from a graphic design standpoint. And part of it is that Wyatt has that skill and I do not. Part of it is also though that Wyatt has that taste and I do not, right? Just because I can have an AI build it for me doesn't mean I know that I have exactly the right aesthetic sensibility of what it should be, right? Like that's part of what Wyatt brings to his job beyond just being able to use Adobe Photoshop or whatever. And so I think those elements will still be there. And I think there'll be new jobs that we don't think about or know about yet. I agree with you on artisans. What are some of the other ones you think of?
What I'm thinking about, I saw this like amazing Twitter thread the other day about the way in which the Industrial Revolution changed our perception of time. So you imagine like back in the day, there was like the town clock on the church bell, right? And then people ended up having clocks at home, but they weren't all standardized. And that didn't necessarily matter until the industrial era when people like had to be at the factory at a certain period of time. And so there was, as a consequence, a job called a window knocker. And they would go to your house and tap on your window with a stick until you woke up to ensure that you were up in time to get to your factory job. Obviously, like with the technology of alarm clocks, the window knocker is not a position that exists anymore, but like how many other positions have been created since then? Even though, the poor window knockers were like, cut out of a whole economy with the like standardization of time and the like emergence of clocks that, could alarm you to when you need to be awakened. So I don't know. I'm more excited about like the idea that there'll be more time, particularly for what you just noted around the creativity. Because I do feel like there are only so many hours in the day. And even in my own job, there are things that could be automated that I have or have not automated yet. And what would I do with the extra space? What new innovations would come up for me if I was not bogged down by sort of like, I don't know, trite, rote, ridiculously redundant parts of my job. Andrew, are you raising your hand because you have a question?
Or comment either?
Oh, yeah, I had a comment kind of about the art versus creative AI versus like data processing and summarization. And I think that the jobs and tasks that revolve more around the data processing summarization will probably be the first ones that get the most use out of this. Like the art and creative side, I don't think is quite there. There's a really good podcast, the Seth Godin Akimbo podcast, and he recently did an episode where you listen to the whole thing, and at the very end, he was like, "This was actually not even my voice. This was totally AI, and the whole transcript was done with ChatGPT." And I have listened to his podcast a lot, and this one, like, I never have fallen asleep during a podcast of his. But by the end of it, I was like, this is the most boring thing I've ever listened to. Like, I have to turn this off. I'm driving and I'm going to fall asleep. So I emailed him and I told him like, hey, like, I love your podcast, but this one almost put me to sleep, but I could not tell it was a fake voice. Like, I kind of thought maybe the content was generated because it was about AI. But I had no idea about the voice. And he replied and he said, yeah, my wife couldn't even tell. So I think that's like some of the scary parts, like the creative side isn't quite there, but like the deep fakes on the voice and the images are getting way too close. And then the data processing, I think, is what is going to be super useful, like within the next year.
Allison,
so I'll be curious what copy. Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, Andrew, can you just pop in the chat the name of the podcast? Allison was wondering. Sorry, Amanda.
Oh, it's okay. I was going to ask, I was going to say, I'll be curious to see how copyright laws evolve and, what we decide, because right now, right, if you capture an image of someone else, you own that image, right? And because AIs are based on so much input data, I think people are really still sorting through like who owns the inputs, and then ultimately who owns the outputs. And so voice in particular, I'm very curious to see what happens from a regulatory standpoint on that. I know obviously he was doing his own voice, but I agree with you. Maybe that one supports Anda's point that you'll just want to talk to a human in person, and that's how you'll know.
Yeah.
They're
That's
standing in
actually
front of you.
a good something that I came across the other day is somebody did a voice of Steve Jobs. And so I was like, this doesn't seem like it should be legal. And it actually varies by state because like if you're posthumous, like you sometimes, depending on the state, you can actually use somebody's likeness in their voice if they've passed away. In some states you can't. So that's a very gray area that I think will probably change a lot over the next couple months.
That's amazing. Allison has another question. I'm going to toss this on to you, Amanda, because it's your world. How do you think talent hiring will change with things like AI, ChatGPT?
Oh, great question. I think we've already started trending in a direction of a lot of early text-based communication, and I think that will probably increase. Which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing, right? Maybe instead of an initial screen with the recruiter, you're in a chatbot type situation or a generated voice, right? We're already really close to these already. They already happen with automation. It would just be adding the decision part, right? And the adaptive nature of the AI to be able to answer someone's questions. So I see the front part of the process changing probably quite a bit. I also think, when I started recruiting, which was, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe I'm even underestimating how long ago it was. It was really important to find out like who someone was, right? Like if there's any other 15-year plus recruiters on this call, they'll remember like you like scrap to get like a phone list, right? Like what's their name, what's their title, what's their phone number, like who are these people who are in software engineering manager roles, right? What is so different already now is that the job is a lot less about who are these people and a lot more about how do we get them to talk to us? How do we get them to care about us? How do we get them to know about us as an employer? And I think that becomes even more critical when you add AI into this, because when you have a chat that writes all the messaging, that sends all the messaging, the volume is thus so greatly increased. To your point about that podcast episode, it all sounds polished and it all sounds the same. And so I think, when you've been on the receiving end, and I know many familiar engineering faces here have been on the receiving end of, an inbox full of messages, right? I think standing out will become even more important, probably building some of those talent communities earlier. And frankly, just getting people to even hear you online, to hear what your job is.
Yeah, I think that really, honestly, it sort of goes to my point. I know digital natives don't necessarily know the difference, but I do think that they are aware of how much anxiety is induced with this much inundation of information, right? The consumption of this, our brain is not set up to consume this many messages. And you see that with Gen Z being the most anxious, the most depressed generation that has existed. And it only begs my own point around like people are going to want to turn it off. You know what I mean? For bigger periods of time, they're going to need to for their own like mental health. We haven't quite figured out how to master the consumption of all this information and the fact that we're going to be inundated with it because it'll be easier to create more of it, with the fact that like it doesn't feel good. We're not meant to be in this state all the time. I mean, even read an article yesterday about the folks who are trying to moderate this, are having like extreme burnout, even mental breakdown, for those that work in the sort of like trust and security divisions of the big tech firms who are creating this, right? Because, in their job of having to sort of like be on, it's exhausting. You know what I mean?
I agree. I'm curious though. This is funny that we're like looping back to the beginning because I feel similarly that it'll be about making it a better experience, but I don't know that that means it's totally offline. Like I think it will be that you hire through like a gaming community, that you know, that tests. There's a company, they're backed by Owl Ventures, which is an ed tech VC, but the name of the company is escaping me. And that they do pre-employment testing, but that it's gamified, but not in the way that we have come to think about gamifying at work, which is like cheesy, like you know, pseudo Jeopardy or whatever else. It's like an actual like immersive, you know, let's say you're like in an underwater scene, right? But it's really looking for like different types of problem solving skills or different types of this or that. And I'm curious if there's other ways we'll use technology to engage people in ways that they're already drawn to it. And then I tend to look at what's going on in pop culture and think, how does that show up at work? And to me, I think there'll be a way that really smart people, smarter than me, figure out how to get people involved online and in spaces that they're enjoying more. And I don't know, again, I don't even want to say that I'm advocating it for it because I don't know if it's good or bad. I keep my phone in grayscale because I'm so anti like being inundated by it, but I'm curious. We have a couple minutes left. Any other comments from our attendees?
Britt, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. I didn't want to be like that guy that just like raised their hand and it was just like in your face on Zoom. So thanks. And I don't have my camera on because I'm totally backlit and I look like a zombie right now. But I did want to ask a question, kind of going back to what you guys were talking about with generative AI potentially taking over like white collar jobs. So I think primarily in tech and in business, people might use that as a supplement to their daily work. But one of the things that I'm thinking about is like, you know, if AI evolves to this point where there is job displacement in those industries. I mean, from a recruiting standpoint, because I'm curious to hear your thoughts, do you believe there's going to be a shift back towards, you know, skilling unskilled people for the trade industry? So, you know, any kind of manual labor work, or, you know, people that might have had a white collar job going back to, or learning, you know, a new skill, for example, like working as a dockhand or something, and then potentially using that information that they've, you know, gleaned from AI to potentially innovate in those types of industries, kind of like a reverse innovation type thing. I'm not sure what to call it, but I mean, I know that, you know, as we continue to explore AI in white collar jobs, you know, we've known for a long time, a lot of blue collar jobs have been going unfilled. And so there's probably going to be a need for those workers to probably reskill themselves and maybe change up industries. So it's kind of what I was thinking.
I do. I think those jobs will, I think the appeal, the market dynamics, right, around those jobs will shift. I've been thinking about this a lot, you know, in my opinion, a lot of the things people want from work haven't changed much. They don't change much. The way we package them and who has the leverage is what changes, right? From the employer to the employee, and how those decisions are made. People want freedom. They want respect. They want to be well paid. You know, those are fairly universal. And so what I see it as is that the leverage around some of these, you know, white collar jobs likely will shift. And the leverage in some of these, you know, skilled trades, especially because to that end, it does require special training to get there. I do see that leverage shifting. I think even within the next 5 years, we'll probably see some more interest in that. Which I think isn't a bad thing, right? I think that might be a positive that comes out of all of this, because those skilled trades are critical for our infrastructure, for our existence, for our society. And so but yes, I would see it going that way, would be my guess.
Amanda, will you share that stat you shared with me this week about the number of jobs that didn't exist in the 1960s?
Yes. There's another stat I read. Let me make sure I don't misquote it. But there are 60% of people today work in jobs that didn't exist in 1940. And so when you think about what that means for the churn of jobs, right? Unless somebody is out there as a window knocker today, I just haven't met them, right? But, we have a way, humans have a way of staying busy and getting creative about it. And sometimes sometimes that means bureaucracy. And sometimes that means, you go to a mall right now and there are a lot of people employed just to entertain you. You're in an escape room and then you go next door to the brew pub, right? Like is that a bad thing? I don't think so. So
Yeah.
that stat leaves you with some hope.
Exactly. It left
Some
me with some
optimism.
hope and excitement actually about the possibility. Like, okay, so this frees us up in some ways to do what? What can it be? Let's look at it with like, how could this be the best possible scenario for us? Well, I thank everyone for joining us. Like I said, this is the first of a series of future of work conversations we'll be bringing to you. Appreciate you spending your morning with us. We will be sending out the recording just in case anyone asks, and we will see you all soon.